I pressed my fingers against the cut above my eyebrow and felt the blood come away warm and sticky on my fingertips. The emergency room lighting was the kind of white that makes everyone look already dead. I sat there in a plastic chair with a torn cocktail dress and my left heel snapped clean off. And I remember thinking, not about the pain, not about what just happened at the party, but about the folder sitting in my car's glove compartment. The one my attorney had been asking me to sign for 3 weeks. I almost smiled. Almost. Let me back up. My name is Phoebe, and I have spent the better part of 28 years being the wrong kind of daughter in the right kind of family. Wrong meaning too quiet, too practical, wrong mother. Wrong bloodline, depending on who you asked and when. My father, Richard, remarried when I was 4 years old. A woman named Christine who came with a daughter of her own, Tara, who was 2 years older than me and who I was expected to love immediately and unconditionally. The way you love a golden retriever someone else picked out. I tried. I really did. Christine was not a cruel woman in the way movies make stepmothers cruel. She didn't lock me in rooms or forget my birthday on purpose. She was cruel the way a thermostat is cruel. Always set just a few degrees too cold for me, perfectly comfortable for everyone else. She called it treating you both the same. But treating 2 children the same when the conditions aren't the same isn't fairness. It's math that doesn't add up. Tara got a car for her 16th birthday. I got a lesson about financial responsibility and a bus pass. Tara's college applications were reviewed by a private consultant Christine hired. Mine were looked over by my father on a Sunday night while he watched football. Tara graduated from University of Virginia with a business degree and walked straight into a position at my father's company, Halton Group, a mid-sized commercial real estate firm based out of Charlotte, North Carolina that my grandfather had built from nothing and that my father had turned into something worth protecting. I went to NC State on a partial scholarship, worked nights at a hotel front desk, graduated with a degree in architecture, and got a job at a firm in Raleigh that had nothing to do with Halton. Which was fine. Which was, honestly, a relief. But 2 years ago, my grandfather died. And that's where everything changes. My grandfather, my father's father, the man who built Halton Group with $40 and a handshake, who used to take me to Waffle House on Sunday mornings and let me draw floor plans on paper napkins. He died in September, quietly, in a hospice facility in Asheville. I flew in from Raleigh. Christine and Tara drove up from Charlotte. My father sat beside the bed and held his hand and none of us spoke very much. What none of us knew, what I didn't know until 6 weeks after the funeral, when an attorney, Mr. Benes Okafor, called me on a Wednesday afternoon, was that my grandfather had updated his estate documents 8 months before he died. He had left me 42% of Halton Group, not to my father, not to the company in trust, to me, specifically, Phoebe Ann Halton, by name, with a letter attached that I have since memorized because I've read it approximately 400 times. The letter said, among other things, I have watched this family for a long time. I have watched you longer. You have your grandmother's eyes and her sense of what's right. Don't let them convince you that you owe them something you don't. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Panera Bread in Raleigh for 45 minutes after that phone call. Then I called my own attorney. I want to be honest here. My first instinct was not revenge. My first instinct was to call my father and tell him. To be transparent, to be the bigger person, to handle it the way I'd always handled everything, quietly and without causing a scene. My attorney, a woman named Ms. Park, who has approximately 0 patience for my tendency toward self-erasure, talked me out of it. You don't know how they're going to react, she said. And you don't know what they've already done with the assumption that those shares didn't exist. She was right. I found out later, much later, that my father and Christine had already restructured 2 major development contracts under the assumption that the ownership distribution was clean, meaning they had moved forward with Tara effectively acting in a capacity she didn't have the authority to act in, on deals worth collectively somewhere around $14 million. I didn't know any of that yet when I got the invitation to the party. Christine's parents, her mother and stepfather, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary at a venue in Charlotte. The Greystone Estate, which is one of those restored Southern plantation-style properties that costs more per evening than most people make in a month. The invitation came to my apartment in Raleigh by actual physical mail, cream-colored cardstock, my name written in calligraphy. Which meant Christine had wanted me there. Which meant she either didn't know about the inheritance yet, or she knew and wanted to manage me in person. I almost didn't go. I was in the middle of reviewing documents with Ms. Park, and I had a presentation due the following Monday, and I genuinely had no desire to spend a Saturday evening watching Tara receive compliments in a room full of people who had always looked through me like glass. But my father called. He didn't call often. When he did, it was usually brief and logistical, information transfer, not conversation. But this call was different. He asked me about work. He asked about my apartment. He said, "It would mean a lot if you came, Phoebe," to Christine. To me. I don't know why that worked. It shouldn't have. 28 years of data points suggested I should have said thank you. I'll try, and then sent a gift card. But something in his voice was different that night. A kind of tiredness that I recognized because I felt it too, and I thought, maybe this is the thing that changes. I drove to Charlotte on Saturday morning. The venue was everything you'd expect. String lights, a jazz quartet, women in floor-length dresses, the smell of expensive floral arrangements and catered food. Christine's family filled most of the room. My father's colleagues from Halton filled the rest. I came in a navy wrap dress I'd bought 2 years ago for a work event. I felt fine until I saw Tara. She was in emerald green, and she looked the way she always looked, effortlessly put together, laughing at something someone had said, the center of whatever circle she stood in. She saw me and waved. I waved back. It was fine. It stayed fine for about 2 hours. The trouble started near the bar, which is where trouble usually starts. I was talking to one of my father's old colleagues, a man named Mr. Mardas Pratt, who used to bring me butterscotch candies when I was little and who genuinely seemed happy to see me. We were talking about a downtown development project I'd worked on in Raleigh when Tara walked over. "Phoebe," she said in the tone she used when she wanted to sound warm but was actually doing something else entirely. "Mr. Pratt was just telling me about the Meridian project. Isn't that the one your firm is consulting on for the city? We're doing the architectural review, yeah. Interesting." She smiled at Mr. Pratt. She's always been the artistic one in the family. It was a small thing. It would have been a small thing if it had been the first time. But it was the 10,000th time. That particular flavor of compliment that doubles as a dismissal, artistic meaning decorative, meaning adjacent to real work, meaning not the kind of daughter who runs a company. I excused myself and went to get some air on the patio. That's where Christine found me. She'd had a few glasses of champagne, not drunk but loosened. She stood beside me at the railing and looked out at the garden and said, without preamble, "Your grandfather made a mistake, you know." I went very still. He always had a soft spot for you, but he didn't understand how businesses work. He didn't understand what Richard has built, what Tara is building. She turned to look at me. The company needs people who are committed to it, who have shown up for it. Not people who walked away. I didn't walk away, I said. I wasn't invited in. You weren't interested. That's not true and you know it. She looked at me for a long moment. There was something in her face I hadn't expected. Not anger, but something more tired than that. Almost sad. Then she said very quietly, "This doesn't have to become difficult. We can handle this like adults, like family." "I am handling it like an adult," I said. "I've been speaking with my attorney." Something shifted in her expression. She set down her glass on the railing and walked back inside. I should have known to leave then. I know that now. I'd gone back over it 100 times. The point at which the night could have ended differently, where I could have gotten my coat and driven back to Raleigh and let the attorneys handle everything through proper channels. But I didn't leave. I went back inside because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of running me off. And because some part of me, the part that had driven 2 hours on a Saturday morning because my father said it would mean a lot, that part still believed something good might happen. It didn't. I was near the entrance hall about 40 minutes later, genuinely preparing to leave. My jacket already over my arm when my father appeared. He'd been drinking. Not heavily, but enough that his face had gone red and his movements were slightly imprecise. He walked toward me, and for a moment I thought he was going to hug me goodbye, which would have been unusual but not impossible. He didn't hug me. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds. He grabbed my arm, said we need to talk right now in a voice that was low and controlled and frightening, and when I pulled back, when I said, "Dad, stop, we can talk tomorrow," he grabbed my shoulders and shoved me, hard, into the antique mirror mounted beside the coat closet. The mirror didn't shatter completely. One large piece broke off and came down, and that's what caught my eyebrow. I went down on one knee on the marble floor. The room, or the part of the room near the entrance, went completely silent. I remember the sound of my own breathing. I remember Tara's voice somewhere behind me saying, "Oh my God." I remember my father standing over me breathing hard and then something happening in his face. Not remorse, exactly, but something like a door closing behind him. He straightened his jacket. He said, "You should go." I looked up at him from the floor with blood running down my face, and I thought about the folder in my glove compartment. The one Mince Park had been asking me to sign for 3 weeks. The one that, once signed and filed, would formally assert my shareholder rights and initiate an audit of all Halton Group transactions from the past 18 months. I got up off the floor without anyone's help. I picked up my jacket. I looked at my father, and I said, very calmly, "Okay." And I walked out. In the car, I held a cocktail napkin against my eyebrow and drove myself to the Atrium Health ER on Randolph Road. 4 stitches. No fracture. The nurse asked me what happened, and I told her I'd walked into a mirror at a party, which was technically true. She gave me the look that means she knew it wasn't the whole truth, and she gave me a pamphlet along with my discharge paperwork, which I folded and put in my purse. I sat in the parking lot for a while. Then I opened the glove compartment. I signed the folder at 11:47 p.m. on a Saturday night in a hospital parking lot with a pen I borrowed from the ER check-in desk and never returned. I took photos of every page on my phone. I texted them to Ms. Mauve Park with a message that said, "Filing Monday." He shoved me into a mirror. "I have 4 stitches." She responded in 40 seconds. "I'm so sorry. We'll be ready." Monday came. I went into work that morning like it was a normal day. I sat through a staff meeting about a municipal library project. I ate lunch at my desk. At 2:15 p.m., Ms. Park filed the formal assertion of shareholder rights with the North Carolina Secretary of State's office. At 2:47 p.m., she sent a certified letter to Halton Group's registered legal address and to my father's personal attorney. At 3:30 p.m., my phone started ringing. The first call was from a number I didn't recognize, turned out to be Tara. I let it go to voicemail. The second was from my father. I let that go too. The third was from Christine, which surprised me enough that I almost answered it. Almost. I let them all go to voicemail and I drove home and made pasta and watched the first episode of a show I'd been meaning to start for months, and I slept better than I had in years. Here is what the next 3 weeks looked like from the outside, very normal. I went to work. I went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning. I called my grandmother on my mother's side, who lives in Wilmington and who has always been my favorite person on earth, and I told her what happened. Not the legal parts. Those were still confidential, but the mirror, the ER, the stitches. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather knew what he was doing." From the inside, those 3 weeks were the audit. Miss Park had retained a forensic accounting firm out of Charlotte, a group that specializes in exactly this kind of intra-family corporate dispute. What they found over the course of 17 business days was not subtle. Tara had been drawing a salary from Halton Group classified as a consulting fee that was approximately 40% above what any comparable position in the Charlotte market would pay. More significantly, 2 development contracts, the ones Ms. Park had flagged early on, had been structured in a way that systematically routed profits through a subsidiary LLC that my father and Christine had formed together, separate from the main Halton Group corporate structure, in a way that diluted returns to the general shareholder pool, which meant diluted returns to me. The LLC had been formed 14 months ago, 8 months after my grandfather had updated his estate documents. I don't know if they knew about the inheritance before he died. I've never been able to establish that definitively, but they knew afterward because Mr. Okafor's office had sent the formal notification, and they had apparently decided to move fast. The attorney representing Halton Group tried 3 separate times to set up a settlement conversation before we got to the point of formal litigation. The first offer was a buyout of my shares at an internally assessed valuation, which the forensic accountants calculated was roughly 60 cents on the dollar of actual market value. The second offer added a non-disclosure agreement and what they called a family harmony clause, which is perhaps the most insulting piece of legal language I've ever encountered. The third offer dropped to the NDA and came closer to fair valuation, but still required me to exit the shareholder structure entirely and permanently. Miss Park and I rejected all three. The deposition happened on a Thursday morning in a conference room in downtown Charlotte. My father came in with 2 attorneys and he looked terrible. Not poorly dressed, but diminished somehow, like something had gone out of him. He didn't look at me directly for the first 40 minutes. Tara was deposed separately, on a different day, and I wasn't there for it, but Ms. B. Park told me afterward that it had not gone well for her. What I didn't anticipate, the thing none of us had fully anticipated, was the outside piece. One of the development contracts that had been routed through the subsidiary LLC involved a parcel of land in a Charlotte neighborhood that was zoned residential. Getting that rezoned for commercial development had required approval from the City Planning Commission. And one of the people who had voted to approve the rezoning was a city council member who had also, according to financial records that became part of the discovery process, received a donation to his political action committee from the subsidiary LLC 2 weeks before the vote. That was not something my attorneys introduced. It came out in discovery and it went somewhere else entirely, to a reporter at the Charlotte Observer who had apparently been looking at the council member for a completely separate reason and found the connection while pulling LLC records. The story ran on a Wednesday. My father's name was in the second paragraph. I found out about it the way most people found out, on my phone, from a push notification, while I was standing in line at a coffee shop in Raleigh waiting for an oat milk latte, which feels like an absurd detail, but it's the true one. I read the article twice. I finished getting my coffee. I sat down at a table by the window and I looked out at the street for a while. The settlement that came 2 weeks after that was the one we accepted. Full fair market valuation of my shares, back payment of the diluted returns from the LLC period, and a restructuring of the Halton Group governance to include an independent board member, something my grandfather had apparently recommended years ago and that my father had never implemented. I retained my shares. I did not have to exit the structure. I did not sign an NDA. I am, as of this spring, a 42% shareholder of Houghton Group, sitting on the board, with a vote that counts. Tara left the company. That wasn't part of the settlement. It was her own decision, and I don't know exactly what led to it. I heard through my grandmother that she's doing something in real estate on her own now, a smaller operation somewhere in the Research Triangle. I don't wish her badly. I genuinely don't. She made choices that I might have made too if I'd been raised the way she was raised, surrounded by people who kept telling her the math always worked in her favor. The math didn't work in her favor. My father and I have not spoken since the deposition. I don't know what that means long term. I still love him, which is the complicated thing nobody tells you about situations like this. That you can hold someone accountable and still feel the loss of them. That those two things are not mutually exclusive. That you can sit in a boardroom across from someone who shoved you into a mirror and still remember that he took you to baseball games when you were 7 and called you his girl and meant it. But love without accountability is just hope, and hope alone is not a plan. Christine sent me an email 3 months ago. 3 sentences. She said she was sorry for the way things had escalated. She said she hoped I was well. She said she thought my grandfather would be proud of me. I read it many times. I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure what I want to say. That might be the most honest thing I can tell you. That I don't have a clean ending for this part because I'm still in it. There's no moment where I looked at the rubble and felt completely satisfied. There's no version of this where I got back everything that was taken from me, because some of what was taken can't be filed in a courthouse. What I have is this: a seat at the table I was born entitled to. A vote that counts. A letter from my grandfather that I keep in the top drawer of my desk at work, under a copy of the Halton Group original Articles of Incorporation. I have 4 stitches worth of proof that I didn't imagine the way things were. And I have the knowledge, the very specific, very clarifying knowledge, that on a Saturday night in a hospital parking lot with a borrowed pen and a cocktail napkin pressed against my eyebrow, I made the decision that changed everything. Not for them, for me. That's the part they never accounted for. They looked at me my whole life and saw someone who would eventually go away. Someone who could be managed, minimized, made small enough to fit into whatever space they decided I deserved. They never once considered that I had been paying attention the whole time, that I had my grandfather's letter, that I had a 42% stake in an attorney who doesn't believe in courtesy discounts. They built their certainty on the wrong foundation, and when it cracked all the way down. People ask me sometimes, now that it's over, now that the settlement is signed and my name is on the shareholder registry, and I sit in that boardroom with a vote that actually counts, they ask if I feel like I won. And I have to think about it longer than they expect me to. Here's what I know. Richard didn't shove me into that mirror because he was powerful. He shoved me because he wasn't. A man who is genuinely secure in what he has built doesn't grab his daughter's shoulders at his wife's parents' anniversary party in front of 50 witnesses and lose it over a legal filing. What I saw in his face in that moment wasn't strength. It was the specific panic of someone who has spent years building something on a foundation they knew wasn't solid and who just heard the first crack. That's not winning. That's what the end of a long bad choice looks like. I spent a lot of years interpreting their treatment of me as evidence of something wrong with me. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about family dynamics like this. The way being dismissed over and over and over starts to sound like information. Like maybe they see something you don't. Christine's cold thermostat. My father's distracted Sunday night help with college applications while the game was on. Tara getting the consultant, the car, the entry point into the company. I absorbed all of it, and somewhere along the way I started to believe it was a verdict. My grandfather knew better. He watched for decades, and he wrote me a letter and he made a decision that said, I see you differently than they do, and I trust my own eyes. That letter didn't give me the inheritance. It gave me permission to believe I'd been right about myself the whole time. The tricky thing about integrity, real integrity, the kind that doesn't bend when it's inconvenient, is that it works slowly. I didn't get my seat at that table because I fought for it loudly or because I burned something down. I got it because I'd spent 28 years making careful decisions, building a real career, keeping my word to people who weren't my family, learning how actual structures work. My grandfather watched all of that. Ms. Park saw all of that. The forensic accountants found a paper trail that told a very clear story, and the story was, one side of this family built things correctly, and the other side cut corners and hoped no one looked too closely. Corners always get looked at. Eventually. What I want to say to anyone in a situation that looks even vaguely like mine is this. The people who minimize you are not neutral observers. They have reasons. Those reasons are usually about them, their fears, their math, their need to keep the margins in their favor. When someone tells you that you're not the right kind of person for something, it's worth asking, right for whom? By what standard? Set by who? I'm not carrying anger about any of it. I've tried anger and it's expensive and it keeps you in the parking lot when you should be driving home. What I carry instead is clarity. About what happened, about what it cost, about what I'm actually worth. Which turns out to be, among other things, 42% of a company my grandfather built. He knew what he was doing. I'm learning, slowly, to trust that I do too.